All right. It says we're on the air, so hopefully this worked.
Hopefully this worked.
Yeah.
Which
I'm
was
pretty.
etched on his tombstone.
I was about to say, I'm pretty sure those are the most famous last words ever uttered.
Okay, welcome back from the longest commercial break in the history of Moonhawk Studios presents.
But we don't have advertisers.
We were chatting with Ben Heck, and I totally lost the thread of conversation. So everybody just dogpile on questions.
Well, Alex, you wanted to ask about the Nintendo PlayStation.
Yeah, just I am less of a PC gamer than console gamer, although I do like your PC builds. But the Nintendo PlayStation was kind of an interesting thing because that was kind of a almost a holy grail to some people of that was a thing that existed, and
you mean
managed...
until it was found?
Yeah,
right.
Like, because it was always like, for a long time, it was kind of a hearsay that I guess everybody sort of, I don't know if anybody didn't believe it, but it was...
Yeah, just like the Atari landfill.
Mm-hmm. Right, and then there was proof that not only it definitely actually happened, and also, hey, they actually made prototypes, they got to that stage. So, how did you think that was like a particularly interesting thing as someone who's less of a console gamer and like
I'm a console gamer. I mean, I play console and PC.
Yeah.
It just depends on the game.
Yeah. And like how like structurally is that kind of thing particularly interesting to you as a mixed up thing?
Structurally, what do you mean?
Like as a mixed CD and cartridge thing.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, if you go back in the history, Sony and Nintendo, didn't used to be bitter rivals. There are a lot of Sony parts inside of the Super Nintendo, for instance. Sony's obviously, or like even nowadays, Sony puts their cameras into basically every cell phone. Like every cell phone with a decent camera is a Sony camera. So back then, they weren't bitter rivals, and Nintendo wanted a CD system, and Sony built a prototype. And that's where this thing came from. And there's going to be two things. There was going to be a CD-ROM add-on that would plug underneath of your Super Nintendo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like the Sega CD ended up being. And then also there was going to be a combination Super Nintendo CD-ROM system that would be like an all-in-one system, just like the rarely seen Sega CD JVC XIs, where it's like basically all in one unit. Or the Turbo Duo for the TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine market. So it was interesting to look at because it was kind of an urban legend. But the thing that was interesting to see when you were actually taking it apart and looking at it was just how far along it was. How close it was to being an actual product.
Mm-hmm.
The casing was really well done. It had certain things in it that clearly they were planning ahead for a production launch. For instance, the cartridge area was a separate piece of plastic from the main molding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Japanese Super Famicom cartridges had rounded corners, and the American ones were square, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
that's what they did for region locking back then.
Yep. So instead of making an entirely different mold for the top half of the unit, there's a separate piece of plastic around the cartridge area that you could pull off. So they would region lock it by putting a separate molded piece just in that area.
Kind of like they did with the Nintendo 64.
Is that how they did that?
Yeah, you take off a piece of plastic with a security hex, and then you can play Japanese games no problem on the American system. That's how mine's set up.
I guess my point is there is a separate piece of plastic around the cartridge area, so they could use 99% of the tooling, which is quite expensive for the plastic mold. They could use it in either region, and then the area around the cartridge they just snap that on afterwards, depending on what system what region it was going towards, right? They had that. I mean, there were some witness marks, which is where the pistons push out the molding. You can see those. That was a little sloppy. But then also on the board itself, there were some bodges, which is where there's a mistake in the PCB design. So they manually solder on some wires to make up for it. There were some, but not too bad. There was only about 6 or 7, I want to say, which is pretty good for a prototype. I mean, there's Sega Genesises that have production bodge wires in them,
Yeah.
like shipped out, because it's cheaper to pay someone to solder on that wire than it is to respin the board.
Right.
Yeah, so I would say that was the biggest thing of interest to me was just how close it was to a real machine in as far as production's concerned, and all the dates and everything was like I think like September, October of '91. So this thing was already well into the works before the Super Nintendo even came to North America, or around the same time it came to North America. So this would have been, if this thing would have come out, it would have probably been like a '92. So it would have been like not a year, or not even a year after the Super Nintendo's release in America, and only 2 years after its release in Japan.
Which is pretty quick for any console thing, but especially back then.
Possibly too quick. I mean, if you look at the Sega Genesis, it was 88 in Japan, and then I believe it was 92 and 93 for the Sega CD-ROM. So a little bit more of a gap. The biggest thing that struck me when I was, looking at the system was, it was basically a Super Nintendo with a CD-ROM memory attachment on it, right? There were no additional capabilities provided by the system, which is different than the Sega CD-ROM. The Sega CD-ROM add-on has a secondary Motorola 68000 CPU. So it's got an extra CPU. It has an extra video processing unit. It has an extra sound unit. It has a lot more RAM. I mean, it's almost basically the hardware inside of the Sega CD-ROM add-on is more powerful than what's in the Genesis itself.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas with this thing, it was just a mass storage device, more or less.
So it would have just been more game and possibly better sound.
Yes, correct. Another limitation, and this is something I was thinking about when we were working on it the last time. One of the strategies of the Super Nintendo, because the Super Nintendo has a really, really wimpy CPU. I mean, it was woefully underclocked or underpowered. So pretty much right from the get-go, like launch titles back in '91, they had additional coprocessors or digital signal processor chips on the cartridge to help with mathematical computations for the game, such as Pilot Wings, right? I mean, if you think about like the original Nintendo, they didn't start putting extra ROM bank switching chips into the cartridges until like 1997, or I'm sorry, 2007. I'm sorry, 1987.
Dates are hard, right?
One of those sevens
are getting hard. Anyway, but whereas the Super Nintendo, they were putting them in right at the start, right, and they would use those special chips to allow games, not just like Star Fox, but things like Pilot Wings or Super Mario Kart, anything that had like any sort of 3D pseudo calculations. And the PlayStation prototype system, it had a cartridge that you plug into it. And the cartridge was basically an 8K battery backed up RAM, which would be like your save games. And then I want to say it was 512. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 256K RAM that you would load off the disk. So basically, you would load 256K of program data off of the disk onto the cartridge into its RAM, then you execute it, right? And that was it. I mean, there weren't any sort of additional coprocessors or digital signal processors in there. So some games like Pilot Wings, Super Mario Kart wouldn't have even been possible with that system. You couldn't because you had that static cartridge. Like you plug in the cartridge, and the cartridge is actually the BIOS that loads things off of the CD-ROM drive. But it also has to serve as your game cartridge, or everything that's going to be used in the game. And if you don't have those extra chips involved, you're not going to be able to do anything else. And there are a lot of Super Nintendo games that had, quite a few coprocessors or, helper chips on the cartridge because, again, the CPU of the Super Nintendo was junk. And it was a so slow. I mean, it's a 16-bit system, and the CPU only had 8-bit data bus access. So janky. Anyway, I get okay. The reason I bring all of that up is because I think part of it was the system probably would have been a dog, and that might be part of the reason it was killed off.
Okay.
Well,
I
and
guess
if
that would make
I
sense.
guess if it would have went into production fully, they probably could have put like Super FX chips on different cartridges too, and just like incrementally release more powerful cartridges for it if they
Yeah,
wanted to.
I was gonna ask about that if it would have been possible to. So this cartridge doesn't do much, but then we could release
The Super
PlayStation
Advantage power.
I was just gonna say PlayStation Plus cartridge or something, but yeah.
They could definitely have done that. Something to think about though that would have been a challenge is that you would have to sell another cartridge that has not only a Super FX chip, but 256K of RAM, which sounds like a joke now, but RAM used to be very expensive back in the early 90s
yeah.
or time earlier. So
That cartridge easily would have been over $100.
yeah, that's what everyone forgets about now. When everyone's complaining about a $60 AAA game with DLC, it's like there were Super Nintendo games that cost $70 in early 1990s money, like Star Fox, because you're putting in extra RAM chips, you're putting in extra signal processors, and that added up pretty quickly. So I guess my point is, yes, you could have made additional cartridges for that system that had those processors inside of it, but it would have added even more cost, and it just probably wouldn't have been worth it. And the Super Nintendo did perfectly fine without all of that. So I mean, I guess it worked out okay in the end.
I would agree on that, definitely.
The other thing to keep in mind was that the Super FX chip didn't come out until 1995. So if this system was in production,
1993.
Oh, okay. Well, still, that puts it at least a year after the release of the production schedule that they were working on for this add-on unit. So the only reason that they even created it in the first place was to extend the life of the Super Nintendo because they were not yet ready to move on to the next console.
Well, again, I mean, it worked out
So
in the end.
adding on an FX chip to a cartridge to this might not even have been on the drawing board at the time this thing was scrapped.
Yeah, it might not have been on the drawing board, but it could have been possible if they needed it.
Well, there is a precedence for it. Atari did it with the 2600 for years. The game Pitfall 2 has a full soundtrack, such as it is, plus additional colors and sprites, all because they added a massive amount of hardware to it. Unfortunately,
that was made by Activision, but yes, there was I wouldn't say a co-processor, but an expansion chip instead of the Pitfall 2 cartridge that did some pretty cool things. Yes.
Yeah. That's one of the things that makes old consoles like the NES and Atari real interesting, because you could put cool stuff like that on the cartridges.
Yeah,
and you can't really do that with flash systems like the 3DS or DS and whatnot.
I mean, you probably could because, technically it's a little PCB with a flash memory on it, but there's not very much physical space to add that stuff. Not like there used to be. Especially if you think about like the American Nintendo cartridges. I mean, they were half empty because they made them bigger on purpose to make them look like VCR tapes instead of game cartridges.
Yep.
But I mean, even then, like we had like the MMC3 processor, which was not quite a coprocessor, but it could do quite a few things. They used that on a lot of games. And they had MMC5, which had its own multiplication hardware on it. I mean, they were pretty much putting coprocessors on the cartridges back in like the late 80s and early 90s. And those games also cost $50 in $1990.
Yeah. I definitely remember as a kid I had a Super Nintendo, and that's why I never had many games for it, because
try being into RPGs during the 16-bit era.
Oh yeah, like Super Mario World was expensive. Anything with a lot of not just RAM, but anything with large mask ROM. Like was it Street Fighter 2 was I think that was $75 or $70 when it came out.
Right. Phantasy Star 4 for the Genesis was $100 in like 1994 money, mind you.
Yeah, that's a big bugbear of mine. I see so many YouTube channels where they complain about they don't complain about the price of games. They complain about DLC and microtransactions, but they don't realize that the price of games has only gone up 20% in 27 years, and it's like, holy cow, you know?
Well,
Yeah.
microtransactions and DLC is its own kettle of fish. But the actual price of games hasn't changed that much in 2 generations. Actually.
Exactly, which is why you put less in the game and then you make up for it with the microtransactions. It's like when you go to the store and the box of Hamburger Helper is $2.50, just like it has been for 20 years, but the box keeps getting smaller and smaller. So you have to add in more cheese or broccoli, and that's like the DLC that you have to add in to bulk it up to what it was before.
Don't get me started on the dents in the bottom of peanut butter jars.
No, but it's a great analogy because any food item that is not sold by weight but by quantity of box, they hide the inflation by making the box smaller or putting a dent in the bottom of the jar, or they do that in bars. They put dents in the bottoms of the glasses. So it's like, oh, the price hasn't gone up, but the quantity has gone down. And you see that with video games. They've kept the price, even keeping the price at $60 for 12 years is pretty unheard of, you know, as far as inflation is concerned. I mean, it should be more like $75. Yeah, so they have to make up for it somehow. I'm not trying to sound like a video game industry shill. It just astounds me how many YouTube people don't understand inflation.
Yeah.
I get that. It's just the video game industry does so many other things that make microtransactions and DLC so ugly, like loot boxes. Like,
yeah. I mean, who cares what color their gun is? I mean, I don't.
Apparently some people do. Yeah, they're willing to spend hundreds of dollars a week on this crap.
I heard Steam or Valve make something like $5 or $7 million a week just off CS:GO skins.
Yep.
That's insane.
Yeah. Like, anyway, one thing I wanted to ask you was about the Bill Paxton pinball machine.
Oh, it's a completely different subject from DLC, but yes, go on.
Sorry, I wanted to keep things focused.
Oh, I agree.
But in addition to all your console mods, you do pinball mods as well.
Well, I designed entire pinball machines, actually.
Right. And this is like the Bill Paxton machine was like the world's first indie-produced pinball machine or something like that?
Not really. There had been a few before that. I mean, it was definitely a lot less common at that time. Mm-hmm. I think there was someone took like a 1978 Atari Superman pinball and turned it into a Futurama long before I did my game. It was less common at that time. So yeah, I just bought a bunch of pinball parts off Craigslist. Then I made a custom pinball machine based off Bill Paxton. And because I did that, I ended up building real pinball machines. Full size commercial ones sold at full price and, major production.
Usable at a laundromat near you.
Yeah, exactly. Like Sunshine Laundry in New York.
Wink.
That's not where one has that. That's just like a very high-end laundromat with a lot of pinball machines in New York.
Right, but why Bill Paxton?
Yes, the question I get asked a lot. Well, at the time, I just kind of wanted to build a pinball machine because it seemed like a really interesting challenge. Mm-hmm. And the reason I picked Bill Paxton was I just wanted something like really weird and geeky, right? And I mean, at that time, it probably would have, geekiness would have probably been like Bruce Campbell or Firefly or something like that. But I picked Bill Paxton because he's got a lot of great movies, and he's always really funny in the movies. And he's got a lot of great quotes. Like if you go through all the movies of Bill Paxton, he says a lot of really funny stuff. And I'm like, well, it'd be cool if this machine had a lot of funny dialogue quotes in it. And that's kind of why I went with Bill Paxton. Also because I knew people would be like, why the heck did he make a Bill Paxton pinball machine? I kind of wanted to confuse people with it, and mission accomplished.
Of course, now it seems. Oh, go ahead.
I can respect that.
I was going to say also now it seems more like a fitting tribute.
Yeah, he's dead, unfortunately.
Yeah,
that sucks. Yeah, we'll never get Tombstone 2. Although he died in Tombstone, so
Hell. Spoiler
Tombstone
alert.
2, the rise of Wyatt Earp origins.
Oh God! Don't give Hollywood ideas, please.
And like, yeah, keep in mind, death is no longer a precursor for an actor showing up in a film. I'm like,
Right,
look at
as played Peter Cushing.
Oh, yeah, that's yeah.
yeah. I'm
Well,
like,
welcome to the Uncanny Valley show.
I think we already crossed that a long time ago, friend.
There is no obstacle to a dead actor appearing in movies besides how much their children and heirs want to be paid.
depressing, very depressing, but true.
You know, it's kind of sad in a way because at a certain point, shouldn't people just like let go of the past? You know, like just let it go. I mean, why do we have to like drag out all these mummies and like keep worshiping them? Can't we have something different? Also,
They should, yes.
why have Peter Cushing's CGI ghost in a movie when Ian McDiarmid is still alive and is a much more interesting character as the Emperor? Have him in it instead.
I guess the Emperor was. I guess the Emperor wasn't on the Death Star, and the events of Rogue One and Episode 4 are within days of each other. So,
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that we didn't really need a Rogue One movie at all, but Disney gonna milk this thing to the bone.
Well, I mean, it's like let's spend $20 million resurrecting Peter Cushing, or we could spend like $800,000 hiring Ian McDiarmid, right?
well, here's the even more crazy part about that. They hired another actor, the guy who actually was the stand-in for Tarkin in one of the games, and they hired him to actually act out the parts and then CGI'd Cushing's face and hands onto him.
Well,
So
it's
it
just
was
like, what was it, Fast and the Furious 58, where Paul Walker was dead? And Paul Walker has two brothers, right?
right.
So what they did for that movie was for every shot involving Paul Walker, they filmed it 3 times. They filmed it with one of his brothers for, I don't know, facial movement, another one of his brothers for body movement, and then with another person who was just a regular actor with motion capture. So,
I suppose at least you've got the technology now. Exploiting a dead actor is nothing new. I'm looking at Bruce Lee here.
Or Jason Lee.
Yep. I'm like, it's just, like one of the, no joke, like one of the substitutions they made for Bruce Lee on Game of Death was a cardboard cutout of him.
Yep.
Holy crap.
Yeah, it's pretty poor looking.
Yeah. It's what you had to work with in the early 70s.
Yeah. So I guess we should bring up the fact that you're also an independent filmmaker.
I haven't done that in quite a while, but yes.
You've made some movies.
And
what was that like?
We're making more movies in the future, so that's something.
What was that like? Was that fun or what?
Yeah, when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I was all into movies, and I'm like, I want to make movies when I grow up, right? And so I was all into making independent movies with my friends. It's tough, because you have to like wrangle people, like get people to like show up for no money. It's like herding cats, That part's really tough. I don't know. I look back to when, because I haven't really shot anything. I mean, besides my show, which I don't shoot, someone else shoots that for me. I think back to like the last time I did that, which was 9 years ago, I think. And I'm like, wow, I was so stupid back then, right? And I'd just like to think if I ever did it again, I'd be a lot smarter, I mean, now I understand, I understand a man with 1,000 faces and all that monomyth stuff. So now I can make nice formulatic Drek that will be easily absorbed by any studio.
But yeah, I guess we won't accidentally blurt out any names of your old films since I have the list right in front of me.
No, we are going to make a third.
Respect.
We are going to make a third Killer Possum movie in 2021. That's on the deck. Oh yeah, definitely. What was it? I was doing a podcast with another friend of mine. He's like, "Hey, I was talking to your other friend," and he's like, "I'm all ready to be the twin brother of the character who died in the previous movie, just like in City Slickers 2: The Legend of Curly's Gold, where Jack Palance played his brother." You know that? Yeah, but actually, besides that, we're working on 2 movies right now. We're doing like a science fiction film, and then a horror movie, like a haunted house. A girl has a haunted house kind of movie. I won't be like really that involved in those. I'm just like story credit and some screenplay stuff. But those should be in the works in the next year.
Nice.
So I guess what I'm saying is I am slowly getting back to that. So the world thought they'd seen the last of my movies. They were wrong.
Ben Hex.
Dead wrong. Roll the credits.
We even have this idea for an Oscar bait movie. We like between shots at work, we come up with ideas for Oscar bait movies. Yeah. Do you want to hear about it?
Let's hear this. I want to hear the pitch on this one.
Right. So the working title is Hooker Heart.
Oh no.
So the way this came up was we were trying to figure out a movie that could save Natalie Portman's career. Right?
I don't know. I don't think it could be salvaged after the assassination.
I was about to say, if you pull that off, you deserve your Oscar, friend.
You deserve a Nobel Prize.
But it's strangely enough, as we came up with ideas for the movie, it turned into a Rooney Mara movie. Because you know how like every actress was secretly one of Padme's clones in The Phantom Menace, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like Keira Knightley was in there, and Rose Byrne, I believe, was one of them as well. Well, anyway, Hooker Heart is basically the idea is to make a movie that will win all the Oscars, right? It has everything. It's like World War II, and it has hookers, and it has death, right?
Oh,
That's
boy.
all the categories you need.
All you need. Yes, because you have to have a character that gets killed, and you have to have World War II, and yeah. So, Hooker Heart. That's what we're coming up with. Yeah. Also, we always plan. We have a Disney movie planned out, or like a Disney type movie. Because one day we were filming something, and I think it was either Max or Karen said "Someday is now," and I'm like, that sounds like a song from a Disney movie. And then we generated an entire Disney movie from that. So.
Oh God. So basically, what Disney does now.
Yeah, basically, you have like some secret princess woman who works on a farm, and she's talking to her pet pig, who's like, and she's like, "Don't worry, oinkers, someday we'll move to the castle, but someday." And this is a song. So.
And then it gets real depressing because the pig gets turned into bacon in the next shot.
It doesn't get turned into bacon, but there is a scene in the end of Act 2. Like, are you any guys familiar with Monomyth? Joseph Campbell,
Yes.
Man of
Yes.
All right, so the point in that story where you get to Magic Flight is where the evil Vizier or whatever would take over the castle, and then he would send the pig to the slaughterhouse, right? And then you have like the scene from Little Mermaid where the crab's going to get sliced up, but with a pig. And then he rallies all the other animals, and they escape from the slaughterhouse, and then they storm the castle to help the secret princess. Boom, $400 million, Frozen 2.
Someone's got a plan.
I can hear Ed Wood rolling in his grave, and I couldn't be happier.
But no, so I was always interested in film, and I spent a lot of time, or wasted a lot of time when I was a teenager working on that kind of stuff. But I like to think that a lot of it came in handy as I got older when we started doing a show, and I would like to get back into it someday, because really, if you think about it, anything, be it a show, be it a video game, be it a pinball machine, it's all about telling stories, and it's just the medium through which you decide to tell those stories.
Outstanding.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I really want to build her heart. I mean, it's basically our thought experiment of how to win all the Oscars.
Hey, you know what? That's how greatness is achieved. Is usually just by faffing about. So
Exactly.
there's
Look
there's
at this
always
podcast.
Any
Hey.
other amazing questions for me?
um,
I got one. Exactly what is the Element 14 community?
Okay, the Element 14 community is part of Newark, which is an online electronics distributor. And what you do is you go on the Element 14 community and you can talk with other people who are into electronics and who are engineers, and you can talk about the products and kind of interact. So it's kind of like the Facebook for engineers. Does that make sense? And so what we do with our show is we get people excited about the community and we lure them to it so they can go on there and interact with other people. So we're kind of the video face of the community, if that makes sense. That's how we started the show many years ago. It was like, hey, we have this new community coming out. Would you like to make a YouTube, at the time it was also on Revision 3, show where we talk about things and we get people excited about the community, and we basically use that as a tool to drive engagement.
And like, how many people are on this platform now?
I don't have that exact number. I think it's hundreds of thousands, though. Don't quote me on that.
it is a number greater than one.
That's a corporate question. So, sorry.
They're like, I am not authorized to give those answers at this time.
That is above my pay grade.
I can't give you answers to numbers I don't know. I can tell you everything you need to know about the movie Hooker Heart. It needs a better name, I know.
I could never hear enough about this.
Oh,
Yes.
Meanwhile,
Yeah.
Max wishing you wins the lottery so we can go green light this.
Yeah. Well,
Win 10
if you've seen our alternate studio logo for Prokontopoulos Studios, it's a film canister crashing headlong into the Parthenon. So, with a way off key version of the Starship Moonhawk theme playing behind it. So, warped sense of humor doesn't even begin to cover it. Oh man. So we're running low on time here, so let's get to the nitty gritty. Do you have any appearances coming up you'd like to plug? Any special upcoming events on your website? Something we need to know about? Burning hearts need to know.
Yeah, I'm going to be appearing at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo next month in Portland, Oregon. Obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any other Portlands, isn't there? There's a lot of portages because that means to carry your boat across land between rivers.
Yeah, I live near the other one.
Yeah.
Maine.
Oh, nice. Yeah, so I'm gonna be there. I think I'm gonna have 2 talks for that, neither of which I planned for, of course, because it's a month away.
Wait,
that's
planning? What the hell is that?
No, sometimes I make PowerPoints. Sometimes.
Every once in a while, I write down 1 or 2 things I want to ask before the show.
You may not believe this, but I'm actually pretty good at BSing and filling time.
Oh, come
I
on!
never could have guessed, sir.
Anyway, yeah, that's the only one that I have really on my calendar. I kind of get conventioned out by about June each year. So then in the second half of the year, I try to take it easy.
Yeah, because a lot of like electronics conventions and stuff like that happen earlier in the year.
Yeah, and they're kind of all the same, and I don't know. It's weird. Like if you go there as a speaker or whatever, it's a different experience,
Yeah.
And if you think about it, like if you're like, ooh, I live in Portland, Oregon, the Portland Retro Gaming Expo is coming up this year. I'm going to go to it. I'm going to take my kids or whatever, That's like one thing a year that you might do in that space, right? But then if you're like a web celebrity, quote unquote, you go to 8 of those things a year and you get completely burned out by them.
Yeah. Like we want to go to E3 at some point, but we wouldn't want to cover that event. Good God, no.
yeah. Well, that's kind of what.
Been there before?
No.
We've
don't
heard
really
horror stories.
Yeah.
It's I don't know if I've been there a couple times. I don't know if I'd say it's horror stories, but it's pretty insane. Although it does smell lovely of new carpet. It's like being in a carpet store.
Yeah. I mean, we don't do a lot of conventions because none of us really live in conventional areas. Like we're not like we don't live on. Nobody here lives on the West Coast.
Right. So not conventional, but convention able.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I have Tucson Comic Con, Phoenix Comic Con. I'm within striking distance of San Diego.
Yeah.
I'm in Tucson, so
You're the closest to that whole thing.
yeah. Well, they're really kind of, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. There's a smattering of things throughout the Midwest, but I mean, like the land itself, it's pretty sparse.
Yeah. Like there could be something happen in the Midwest, but good God, if I could get there.
Oh, I got to get down to Wichita.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was. Well, oh yeah, when we were talking the PlayStation Nintendo prototype, those guys take that thing to like all sorts of shows. I'm like, oh man, how do you guys not get tired of this? But I don't know. Maybe they're well, clearly they're different from me, but I get tired of it pretty quickly. It's like I just want to like spend the weekend playing video games and eating spam. I don't need to be going somewhere every weekend.
Did they have any demo games for that, or is it just a console that doesn't work?
Well, it's a console that does work now, thanks to me.
Yeah, I was about to say it works now, friend.
But pretty much all there is to play on it, I think, is Super Nintendo games and CDs.
No, homebrewers have reverse engineered the code and started programming games for it.
That's cool.
Yes. Yeah, so I think they really need to loan it to someone. Like they need to loan it to a homebrewer because there's a big difference between programming something for an emulated version of a system versus actually putting on the original hardware. Like for instance, the homebrewers who were trying to program games for it, they didn't realize that the system was doing IRQs between the CD hardware and the main CPU. So those are things that you could only really experience when you have the real hardware versus an emulated approximation of it. But I think it's really cool that, the video game scene is so insanely hardcore that they start writing emulators for a system that no one's played. And they basically, base it off their best guess. That's pretty cool. I like to say, like, if JFK was shot today, the internet would figure out the crime in like 3 seconds. And that's what we have. That's what we have nowadays. Like, people reverse engineering stuff so quickly. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, so you can burn games on disk that will run on the system now.
That's cool.
It didn't have any copy protection or whatever. It can just take a disc.
No, none until the PlayStation 1. There was no copy protection, so you could.
Yeah.
Same thing with the TurboGrafx 16 or the Sega CD. You could burn a disc and it would run.
Yep.
Early CD systems, copy protection.
Because remember, back then, a blank CD disc would have cost more than a game.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and they didn't really have CD burners in all the things.
Not exactly. I've duplicated many of my Sega CD games at substantially low.
I mean, that was a big bugbear with the first PlayStation. I mean, publishing the games was super cheap, but actually developing discs or testing discs was actually kind of expensive because you had to burn a disc in 1994, which was not cheap.
Nowadays, you can get a stack of discs for like $5.
Well, heck, I remember even when it was like consumer grade, like in '96 or '97, it was like $25 for a blank disc. It was no joke.
And these couldn't be rewritten.
Nope.
You messed up your burn. You have a waste of plastic on your hands.
That's why you do a verify of a simulation of the disc and then you burn it.
Yeah.
Different times.
Buffer underruns.
I mean, I still have my Nero set up to do that, but that's just because I'm paranoid.
Anything else you guys wanted to know?
I don't think we have time for anything else.
Yeah, I think we're out of time.
All right.
Well, Ben, I really, really appreciate you putting up with our eccentricity and the technical failures there. We're glad we were able to get a full interview in.
All right, no problem.
Really appreciate you coming out talking to us today, and hopefully we'll do it again when your next big project comes down the pike.
All right, I'll talk to you guys. I'll talk to you guys later.
All right, be sure to visit benheck.com to see what Ben's up to. Other than that, what do we got going on next week, Petty Ben?
Currently I don't have a guest slated, but I have interest. They haven't confirmed yet, though.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll have some kind of announcement throughout the week.
Yeah. I should hopefully know by Friday, so we can mention it on our game night session thing.
For our Saturday night commode tweet storm.
No,
Which
no.
never actually happens.
Yeah. We're
Oh,
talking.
and of course, Friday night we'll be experimenting with Last News Desk from the Left.
Are we? I'm like, just a programming note. We got some multiplayer stuff for Fragments to do Friday, and also Hurricane. So keep that one in mind.
If we'll keep that little feather in our cap just in case something happens. Hopefully nothing happens, and we'll be able to proceed accordingly. But with that in mind, I will thank everybody for coming out tonight, and stay safe out there, kids, and hopefully God this thing